a new book from a leading voice on birds and conservation. Welcome back to Techstination. I'm Fred Fishkin. Joining us is Scott Weidensaul, author of nearly 30 books, and the latest arriving this month is The Return of the Oyster Catcher, Saving Birds to Save the Planet. Hi, Scott.
Hey Fred, how you doing?
Terrific. Well, let's start with some of your background and what led you to this book.
Well, I've been involved with birds and bird conservation at this point for, gosh, almost 40 years. I got started when I was just like right out of college. Um, uh, and it's, look, things have been rough for birds for a while. We've known for a while that bird populations overall are in decline. We've seen signs that, particularly with some groups of birds like grassland birds and shorebirds, those declines appear to be accelerating. But we've also, over the years, made some remarkable progress for birds. And I think one of the issues that conservationists deal with right now is, just gloom and doom and despair. It, sometimes you can feel so overwhelmed that you don't know what to do. And I think it's important for us to recognize that all around the world, people are making progress for birds. There are things that are going right for bird conservation. And what's important about that is a world that works for birds will work for everything, including us. There's more than 11,000 species of birds. They're found over quite literally every square mile of this planet over both land and water. And, their migrations encompass sometimes tens of thousands of miles, connecting every ecosystem. If we can figure out a way to make a world that works for birds, we've got it made. So what I'm doing with this book is pulling out examples of bird conservation success stories and showing them as roadmaps for further recovery. Um, we've done this before. Um, I, I graduated high school in 1976, bicentennial year. That year, there were probably fewer than 1,000 bald eagles in the entirety of the lower 48. If you had, we'd lost peregrine falcons, they were completely gone from the east. Ospreys were almost gone. It was this whole litany of birds that um, centuries of persecution and then DDT and other pesticides had all but wiped out. If you had told me that by the time we got to the country's 250th anniversary in 2026, that there would be 400,000 bald eagles in the lower 48, I I would have asked you what you were smoking back there in the 1970s. And yet that's where we are today. We've brought these birds back. Waterfowl populations had crashed in the late 19th century, and then they started to recover in the 30s, and then they crashed again in the 1980s. And in the mid 1980s, we as a society in the US and Canada decided we were going to make things better for birds, for waterfowl in particular. And so in the US, we passed the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, NAWCA. We passed the underlying um, legislation that led to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, really the first transnational bird conservation plan, working first with Canada and later with Mexico. We've poured billions of dollars into habitat restoration for migratory waterfowl, and it worked. I mean, waterfowl populations are probably higher today than they've been since the beginning of the market hunting period in the late 19th century. We certainly have more geese than we've ever had before. In fact, anybody who's scraped goose poop off their shoes at a park understands that maybe the geese have been a little too successful. But that's not a bad problem to have.
So there is optimism here, which is a great message in the book. Tell us about some of the locations that you visited and what you found. You did some traveling here.
I did some traveling here. Yes. So, one of the aspects I wanted to get into is the rewilding movement in Europe, which hasn't really taken off so much in North America, in part because we still have large areas of really wild land with most of our large mammals, our large species there. Whereas across Europe, after tens of thousands of years of human habitation, they've lost an awful lot. But yeah, there's a movement now sweeping Europe called rewilding, and the idea is to bring back to the land either missing large mammals, large native mammals like European bison, which I think most Americans are unaware of the fact that there is a European bison. It's more of a forest animal than a plains animal like our American bison. And they were almost completely lost. They came right to the brink of complete extinction in the early and mid 20th century. But their numbers are increasing dramatically, and they're being used as landscape engineers, bringing them back to places like the Southern Carpathian Mountains in Romania, where they've been extinct for more than 250 years, and where people are abandoning the land. Their small family farms are disappearing as people move to the city, as people move abroad, and this mosaic of small fields and pastures and small woodlots and orchards that have been there, God, since the Middle Ages, on which many species of birds depends. Birds like Eurasian turtle doves and redback shrikes, that habitat is disappearing. But by bringing back the bison, and bison will strip the bark from trees, they'll create openings in the forest, they'll wallow on the ground and create these little micro habitats that are good for insects, that are good for birds. They're maintaining this mosaic of habitat that would otherwise disappear. So, in many different landscapes across Europe, you've got people working with nature to create sustainable habitats that don't require a lot of direct human management. Now, some places, I mean, conservation is always hard. In some places, it's really hard. And one of the places I visited was the Danube River Delta, which is on the border between Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. And as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine has really had the potential to derail a lot of that conservation work. The Danube River Delta is more than 1 million acres. It's the largest wetland in Europe. It is home to more than 300 species of birds. And despite the war, despite the fact that, I was like a third of a mile from the Ukrainian border on the Romanian side of the river, you can hear the air raid sirens going off in Ukraine at night when the Russians launch a missile attack. And yet the conservationists are still out there doing, really important work to restore what is essentially kind of the European equivalent of the Everglades, this enormous wetland area that had been damaged. The hydrology had been changed with, ditching and dams and things like that, and bringing all that back to full, robust life.
And you've also highlighted the role of indigenous communities here. Tell us about that.
Actually, that's, I think, probably the single most inspiring story in this whole book. So this is mostly talking about the boreal forest of Canada, which is at about 1.5 billion acres, the largest intact forest on the planet. It's not the Amazon, it's not the Congo, it's the boreal forest in Canada and Alaska. And it's been home to people for, 10,000 plus years, ever since the Ice Age ended. And it's an area that's also of extraordinary importance to birds. There are more than 300 species of birds that migrate to and from the boreal forest every year. Warblers, vireos, thrushes, tanagers, hummingbirds, whooping cranes, loons, shorebirds. The list just goes on and on and on. And a lot of that land is not in formal conservation protection. Um, but that's changing, and it's changing because the indigenous communities that have lived there since time immemorial are asserting their right to protect and manage their own ancestral lands. And ironically, some of these communities had spent generations fighting against the Canadian government coming in and declaring areas as national parks because traditionally, when the Canadian government did that, they said, okay, now this is now a national park. So you folks can no longer hunt here. You can no longer fish here. You can no longer do your traditional foraging activities here because this is a protected place. Well, you can't throw the people who've lived there for thousands of years off that land. And so what many indigenous communities are doing in the Canadian boreal forest is they are working now in concert with the Canadian government and the provincial and territorial governments to create what are known as Indigenous Protected Areas, IPAs. And some of these are just absolutely enormous. I spent time in a place called Nene, which means land of the ancestors in Dene. Um, Nene Indigenous Protected Area on the east arm of Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. This is 6.5 million acres of some of the most staggeringly beautiful land that you have anywhere in North America. Incredibly rich in birds, incredibly rich in wildlife, and a place where humans have lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years in balance with that land. And after generations of folks in the communities like Lutzel Cay on the side of on the shores of the Great Slave Lake fighting the Canadian government to prevent them from creating a national park that would have kicked them out of their own land. They are now the people in charge of managing it and protecting it into the future. And it's interesting, they don't talk about managing the land. They talk about having a relationship with the land. This is a land that has supported them for, for as long back as their oral traditions carry them. And they're working in many cases in concert with Western scientists, bringing Western ecological conservation science and marrying that with traditional ecological knowledge that, again, goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations on that land. And who better to steward that land into a rapidly changing future? And it is changing rapidly up there. Wildfires are becoming more intense and more common. Climate change is not theoretical in that part of the world. They can see this happening on a year-to-year basis. They're the best people to carry this land into the future. So, and it's enormous areas of land. By the end of this decade, close to 1 billion acres of Canadian boreal forest will be in some form of either formalized or pledged conservation protection under the stewardship of the people who have always lived there.
I guess a bit more optimism there.
Yeah.
So, any thoughts about the role technology and the internet play in the efforts here?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, and this is something that in my own migration research over the years, I've gotten more and more involved in. We have so much more information than we had even just 10 or 15 years ago, because of technology and because of what birders themselves are contributing. Um, if I go out birding, I will keep a checklist on my phone and of how many individuals of what species of birds I saw, how long I was out there, how much ground I covered, and at the end of my birding trip, I can file all of that to submit that to eBird at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Every year, about 100 million checklists like that are submitted by birders, which have given us just a phenomenally detailed portrait of where and in what number and at what time of the year you have birds across, again, almost every square mile of North America and increasingly around the world. And we've been doing this now long enough that we can see how bird populations are changing across from year to year and from decade to decade. And at very fine scales, about 27 kilometers by 27 kilometers. And so, digging into that information is able to show us where bird populations are rising, where bird populations are falling, and give us a hint of what the causes are. So we have an idea of what we need to address to make sure that, we're turning these maps blue. Because if you go on eBird today, there are status and trend maps for almost all of North America's birds. You can see regionally, and, right down to almost your backyard, whether a particular species is doing well or doing poorly. And conservationists are mining that information now to figure out how best to address those bird declines so we can bring them back. And it's worked. I mean, species like wood thrushes, which are one of the most beloved of eastern forest songbirds, and for as long as I've been doing bird conservation, their numbers have been going down year after year after year after year after year. Well, we figured out where the problems were. We figured out the kind of habitat management that was necessary to bring those populations back. And wood thrush populations in the last 10 years, pretty much across their range, have improved. Now, they're still in trouble here in the Northeast where I live, up here in New England. We're not really sure why, but I think we're on the cusp of figuring that out and figuring out how to address those declines as well.
And Cornell, we should mention, has a great app for people who want to identify the songs of birds called Merlin.
Oh yeah.
Download too. That's a lot of fun. And you mentioned backyards. What are your thoughts about the backyard feeders? Lots of them with cameras becoming more and more popular in recent years. Is that
Oh yeah.
encouraging or?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important for us to remember that we put bird feeders out for us. The birds don't really need them. So if we're going to do that, we need to do it right. So if you have a bird feeder, clean it on a regular basis because a dirty bird feeder, all you're doing then is spreading disease among the birds that you're trying to help. So, take the feeder down every 10 days or so, empty it out, wash it out, ideally wash it out with like a dilute bleach solution. If you see sick birds around your feeder, take the feeder down because birds poop and a lot of bird diseases are passed through droppings. Rake the ground under the feeders. Don't let empty seed hulls and things like that build up. But bird feeders, if you do it right, bird feeders are not hurting the birds at all, and it's a great way to connect. You mentioned the Merlin app on the phone. It's a free app from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It will identify bird songs for you. It will tell you all about the birds that you're encountering. The guy that runs the Merlin project is actually one of my former research technicians and a good friend of mine. So I've got I'm delighted to see what they've been able to do. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology is kind of your one-stop shop for good information about birds.
And we recommend your book too. The new one that is called, once again, The Return of the Oyster Catcher Saving Birds to Save the Planet. Scott Weidensaul, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Brett, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for some great questions.
The Haven 10,000 lantern is a smartly designed, beautiful solar light that you will love indoors or out. It is waterproof with up to 1,200 lumens of brightness. That's a lot of light. And the base becomes a flashlight at the push of a button. The power comes from a built-in lithium-ion battery recharged by the sun. The solar panel is built in, or USB-C. The battery can even recharge your phone. Did we mention how durable it is? How it folds down and can run for up to 120 hours on a charge? But the real power of the Haven Lantern comes from the people behind it and their mission to provide this quality lighting to those in the world who need it most, including in disaster emergencies. Your purchase helps to fund those efforts, and if you use the code TEXTINATION20, you'll get it at a 20% discount. That's TEXTINATION20 at havenlantern.com. Create your haven.